So next up on the agenda is we have a presentation from HHA, Mr. Alan Weaver, regarding the economic development impact of this new project. Oh, all right, well.
He just walked out.
Oh. All right.
I don't mean to laugh. Walk that way.
Oh,
There he is.
There he comes.
See all these is here if anybody wants to.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
All right, thanks, Rich. I am, yeah.
And I was just doing your introduction.
My introduction, as if anybody here doesn't already know.
You don't even need that introduction.
Yes, yes.
All right, thanks again, Chris, for coming.
Thank you for having me. I'll let you enjoy the rest of the day.
Yes, well, we'll be in touch. Alan, next, you're on the agenda for the economic development. And I'm going to open up the floor.
Okay, well, we're here to discuss our project down at Bliss Towers, the two new apartment buildings we're talking about building. Our developer, Brian Eager, is here. He has some handouts for the board. I don't know how many we have, but go ahead. Yeah. Can I charge one?
Is the housing authority coming?
I know. You have. Oh, do you have? Okay. Peter?
Should I walk you through the description of the project?
And you know what, could I ask you, do you have this electronic version also?
Yeah, we can do that.
Just better than supposed to. Okay. Yeah, well, we can move this table a little bit.
So as Alan said, we're here to explain and describe the project at the Bliss Towers site, this site, adjacent site across the street at State Street. That is calling the Columbia Apartments redevelopment overall. There are three components to it. Well, first, actually, my name is Brian Eager. I'm with the firm of Duvernay and Brooks. We're one of two developed apartments, part of a joint venture with another firm, the Property Resources Corporation. We have been selected by the Housing Authority after a competitive RFP process to serve as a development partner with the authority for the redevelopment of Bliss Towers and the construction of some new affordable housing, mixed-income housing across the street from Bliss on the State Street site that they own. The project includes three components. The first is the rehabilitation of Bliss Towers, which is 120 apartments. It's sorely in need of redevelopment. It's a 45-year-old redevelopment, and so we are working with the Housing Authority to scope out and plan a substantial rehabilitation with tenants in occupancy so that we minimize the displacement of residents. That would be a top-to-bottom rehabilitation from common areas and lobby to roof, building systems, interiors of apartments, kitchens, bathrooms, hallways, paint walls, flooring. So a renovation of the building from top to bottom that will dramatically improve the lives of the residents. There are also over 20 units right now at the towers that are offline because it's in such poor condition. So restore those and dramatically preserve this vital affordable housing asset for generations to come. That building is going to be rehabilitated under what's called the RAD program. You may have heard that name. It's the HUD Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. HUD is moving all public housing out of the public housing program into RAD or other Section 8 programs Similar programs, because it's a more stable funding platform, funds for public housing have been cut dramatically over the last several decades. And the RAD program allows housing authorities to access private capital markets to undertake redevelopments in partnership with private developers, that you could not do with public housing. So it allows access to private financing you can leverage to do the repairs that are needed. So that's the first and major component of the redevelopment. The other two components are the construction of 2 new 4-story buildings across the street on State Street. One is for low-income housing seniors, and it would be an entirely Section 8 fund building for very low-income seniors. The concept is that there are residents at Bliss Towers that need to, Bliss Towers is now both family and seniors. And nationally, the model is now to separate out seniors and have them in a dedicated building. Is more operationally, socially desirable to have seniors in a separate building from the family units. So those units would be targeted to seniors living at Bliss Towers, and that would open up new units so that families who are currently on the Bliss Towers wait list could move into Bliss Towers, which has a wait list of over 2.5 years, Dental Bliss. And then the third and final component is 40 units in another 4-story adjacent building of new workforce housing for families. It would not be subsidized housing. There'd be no operating subsidy from the housing authority. It would be rent restricted under state and federal funding programs, but the income targeted for that would be between $25,000 and $53,000 a year, depending on unit size. And we're looking at different tiers of affordability there, from 50% of area median income to 70% of area median income. So that would be 40 units. Nearly 80% of the project is targeting residents currently living at Bliss or residents on the wait list. And then there's a small workforce housing component that would introduce diversity of incomes. These are renters who have choice in the marketplace, so we'd have to compete for those renters. All buildings would have would be high quality, have fitness rooms and other amenities that you would see in comparable market rate developments. There have been some questions about, concerns about affordability and whether the residents at Bliss would be forced to leave or have to pay more for rent. That we can put those concerns to rest. The HUD-RAD program comes with a great deal of protection for the residents, so all existing residents will be grandfathered in, have a right to stay at the building or return to the building. Their rents will not increase. They'll continue to be based on the same formulas they are now. The buildings cannot be taken out of the HUD program. The housing authority, even if the housing authority wanted to, that would be up to HUD. And then the buildings on State Street would have long-term affordability commitments, a minimum of 30 years to the state. And then the housing authority is going to continue to not only be an owner of the project, but own the land. So that will remain permanently affordable for as long as the housing authority wants. So the housing authority is an owner of the land, is a partner on the project, and will control, have to approve all major decisions, and will be able to control the long-term affordability of the project.
Hold on a second. Can everyone hear okay?
Yeah.
Everyone?
Question.
How about this? What if you stand over here and address your whole room? What do you got?
Thank you, Rich.
Okay. This way, yeah.
So I said the affordability, there are long-term affordability restrictions to ensure that the residents at Bliss won't have to pay more for rent or be forced out of their housing. RAD is not a program that privatizes housing. It's just intended by HUD to help housing authorities address the sorely needed capital needs of public housing by tapping the expertise of private developers and the private capital markets. As I mentioned earlier, the concept behind the Bliss Tower rehab is tenant in place. Our firms, our partner firm, Property Resources Corporation, is one of the state's leading experts in doing that kind of rehabilitation, which requires a great deal of communication and coordination to minimize disruption of the residents, and work is done without having, for the most part, having residents to have to relocate, which would be a great deal of burden not only on the residents but on the city of Hudson, because it's a very large building. Overall, you know, we've looked at the market, we've gotten a market study, we've analyzed the city's strategic housing plan, and we feel the project fits in with that strategic housing plan. Over 65% of the population, the households in the city of Hudson are renters. A large number of them are rent burdened. They pay more than 35% of their income for rent. That's over 43% according to census data. The median income for households in the city of Hudson, based on recent census data, is a little over $35,000 per household. And as I mentioned, the rental range for the new family units of State Street will range up to, from approximately, that chart there, $25,000 up to about $53,000. So it's targeting, you know, as we said, service workers in the community, people in need of affordable housing in the community who are currently rent burdened. But they also have options. As I mentioned, doesn't have an operating subsidy. They have to pass credit checks. They have to demonstrate steady employment, be able to pay their rent just like in any other you know, market rate rental development. The Housing Authority is looking to undertake the redevelopment and do the RAD redevelopment, not only because Bliss Towers is sorely in need of rehabilitation, but given the funding cuts at HUD, it's putting housing authorities across the country in a very precarious situation where they need to move forward to create more stable funding platforms. And so the redevelopment, including in State Street, will generate fees and cash flow to the housing authority that help ensure that it remains viable for the long term and able to continue its mission of providing affordable housing. Really lastly, I want to just talk about the economic impact of the project itself. HUD has a minimum requirement, and we will work with the housing authority set goals to far exceed that, of a minimum of 30% of all new hires for construction jobs have to come from the local area. So we'll meet and exceed that goal. Overall, we estimate that the project's budget exceeds $50 million, so we estimate an overall economic impact to the city of over $65 million for the project as a whole for the development. And then long term, since the new projects are being new households are being added to State Street, that would add an additional $3 million of local economic spending annually as that impact from the new residents on State Street, from the new senior and the new family units. So our feeling with the Housing Authority is that we are serving an enormous unmet need for affordable and mixed income housing, while also providing an additional economic impact, positive impact to the city of Hudson.
Questions from the other members of the committee?
How is this financed?
It's a mix of public and private financing. The primary financing vehicle would be state taxes and bond financing, and then a number of state subsidy programs. And then we bring in investors by selling tax credits that the federal tax credits that the state would allocate with their tax and bond financing to investors who are looking for invest in affordable housing for tax benefits.
Is it typical? I noticed that your project in New Rochelle, the PRC and your firm entered into as a pilot agreement with the city of New Rochelle over 15 years. Is this typical for?
That is typical. The state, to do the financing and the investors, look for a pilot agreement because they need to know that there's the operating expenses are stable so that they can underwrite the financing for the project. So they need to know what the taxes are. They're also looking to, that as a measure of local support for the project. So that is typical for affordable housing across the country, but in New York State in particular.
I'm curious. Okay.
No, go ahead, John.
On your website, what's something called a Choice Neighborhoods initiative that HUD has, and that's part of consulting services that you guys provide.
Yeah, Choice Neighborhoods. Yeah, Choice Neighborhoods is a program HUD does. It's a sort of to revitalize communities, particularly. It's a replacement for a program they called Hope 6, which was instituted under the Clinton administration to redevelop public housing, primarily through a mix of demolition and new construction. Choice Neighborhoods is very similar to that. They expanded upon that to do more neighborhood-wide revitalization. It's a very small program at this time under the current administration. It's largely targeted at large cities, but it's still, there are 5 or 6 grants awarded a year of Choice Neighborhoods. But the primary focus of HUD right now is the RAD program.
Right, sure.
Because they're trying to do something that's revenue neutral rather than choice, which the federal government puts new money into.
Right.
But-
And RAD doesn't explicitly have to be private-public. There's a public component to RAD too. That was experimental. This is relatively new.
Yeah, I mean, the RAD part of it is the conversion of the public housing to a different funding program. It's really a type of Section 8.
Mm-hmm.
The private sector involvement comes in two ways. It's through the financing, so the intent was Section 8, you can go to a bank and get, or the bond markets and get a loan. You can't, or it's much more difficult to do that with public housing, because technically you can't borrow money against public housing operating subsidy. So that's the RAD program, so the private sector comes in through the financing. And then in many housing authorities, there are a few who do it themselves, but most housing authorities don't have the capacity or the balance sheets necessary to go to do real estate development, or to go to private capital markets and borrow money, whether it's a bank or the bond markets. So they look to private developers who will provide all of the guarantees needed to the banks to ensure repayment of the loans. Will guarantee the construction. This is overall a $50 million project, so there are pretty substantial contingent liabilities and guarantees that have to be made on behalf of the project. And then, of course, there's a great deal of pre-development expenditures in planning and a project of this type. So housing authorities typically don't have that kind of money either. So that's why they look to the private sector to bring expertise and funding.
The pilot, and you had talked about this at the meeting down at Bliss Towers, you would see the request for a pilot similar to what Bliss and Providence and what's being paid now, formula, percent of gross shelter rents?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we've made a proposal. I'll have to defer to the Housing Authority and their council on what they're currently paying. I think it was a similar formula.
Dan Hubble, counsel for the authority. So there is currently right now the pilot replaces what's a requirement of HUD funding. As it is under New York State law, the authority property is exempt from real property taxes by under the public housing law. Here, for the reasons Brian was saying, funders generally like to see some sort of surety in terms of if there would be tax payments, as well as a way to engage in public support. The formula right now is a bit of a complex formula, but essentially it's based upon net revenues of the authority. Works out right now to a little less than $50,000 a year is what it is now. So what we're doing is we're going to be redoing the pilot agreement. Spoke with Corp Counsel today a little bit about that. There's a draft that we're going to be sending him. In my understanding, some other concerns that the City Council may have regarding not environmental issues that the Planning Board is going to be handling, but more policy concerns, and that might be a venue or a way in which to incorporate some of those concerns.
Any other questions?
Let me just get a follow-up on that. So the more successful the project is, the formula would mean more tax revenue to the city.
I have not had any discussions with Corp Counsel or the city yet as to what the pilot amount would be. I think that there's a lot of issues that have come up with this project that need to be discussed with the City Council. Pilot amount is one of many, and so right now, there's a blank in there as to what that amount is, because I think we just need to talk through.
Okay, so not a formula, not something that starts with rents and...
I think we have to have a discussion and figure out together what that looks like. We're seeing this as more of an iterative process here than necessarily us coming and saying, we're paying X.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions from...
One last point I did fail to mention. The new development does include some additional space for non-residential space for retail or nonprofit space. At the Housing Authority right now, there are a couple of apartments being used for social service provision. Those hopefully could move over to State Street in this new space and have additional incremental space for local retail, so that will help activate the street fund as well.
Okay, I'd like to open up this discussion to the floor, so please raise your hand and state your name and your address or ward. Anyone like to start? No.
A little more detail on your financing, because I believe, if I heard correctly, and correct me if I didn't, that this is an entirely Section 8 housing project.
No, it's so of the three components, the tower, which is now public housing,
Right.
is going to be RAD. So it's a type of Section 8.
Right.
Then the senior building, it's actually 36 units. I know it says 33 there, but
Right.
it's going to be for seniors Section 8. And the idea is those are people who are already living at Bliss Towers, very low income, so it would need to be a project-based Section 8 subsidy for them. Then the remaining component, the 40-unit family building, is not Section 8. It's workforce housing for higher income levels.
And that's where the low-income housing tax credits come in?
Right. All of the units would technically qualify for low-income housing tax credits. A lot of times when you hear people refer to low-income housing tax credit units, it would be the ones that don't have Section 8 subsidy. But technically, all of them would qualify for the low-income housing tax credits, and that helps finance the project. But the family unit is not Section 8 and does not have operating subsidy.
How long would the operating agreement be between PRC and HHA?
Well,
Or how long are they typically in this?
yeah, so the operating agreements typically don't have, the way these are set up, I think the best way to answer that is there's an operating agreement when you close on the financing between the housing authority and our firms and the tax credit investors, and that forms the ownership entity. The affordability is restricted by the state for a minimum of 30 years. So the agreement goes, is very long term. I don't even defer to Dan, but I don't think there's typically a term on the agreement itself. But the affordability period will be at least 30 years, and then after 15 years, the housing authority will have the option to take over the sole ownership of the project. The tax credit investor will typically exit. The private developers can then exit as well if the housing authority wants to take over and be the sole owner of it. At which point the partnership would terminate because they would just be owning the project entirely.
So in the sense that is it potentially be back here, Danny, 15 years out, trying to find a new operator?
No, at that point it would be the housing authority could choose to be the sole owner, but it wouldn't necessarily. It wouldn't necessarily need any new financing at that time. It would depend on the condition of the building. The buildings are under the HUD-RAD program have to be repaired to a quality that's a minimum of 20 years. And the bond financing goes out for 30 years. So investors and lenders are looking at doing engineering studies to make sure that the new redeveloped Bliss Towers will last for at least the term of the bond, so that's 30 years. And then the new construction on the State Street side will be brand new buildings. So in 15 years, it's possible the housing authority may want to take out a loan and do some refreshing of the buildings, but it's not something that would need new financing.
Anyone else?
Can I have a question?
Yes.
Sorry, Dominic Fitzward. The market rate, is that still going to be Section 8 available though?
The 40 tax credit units, yeah, I mean by law, if someone with a Section 8 voucher came to that building, they can't be rejected because of that. But they don't have a subsidy that comes with the units. So.
Right. So, but if somebody comes in with a Section 8 voucher from wherever,
it would be subject to the same rules and legal requirements of any rental building anywhere.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm back in my big mouth. And I'm going to really be much briefer this time because I'm just following along what you're saying. I have a bunch of problems with that, some of which just came up just now. If the high-rise and low-rise are paying $50,000 in pilots now for that whole project that it currently exists, I mean, there are some individual taxpayers in single houses that are paying, $15,000 for one house. So it's woefully under what it should be to compare it to anything else that's already getting pilots. The other thing too is just for information, just by doing the math, currently between the high-rise and the low-rise, the average apartment there rents for somewhat under $500 a month. going by the budget and sources of funding that are presently in place. So if that factors into the pilot, you can see where it would really be too low. I feel that the development is too big in scale for the size of the city. And I've said this is my third time repeating it. I feel like it's too big in scale for the size of the city. I think that the studies that have been done have been regional, and yet the problem is being solved, if you will, very, very hyper-locally. In 1966, some low-income tenants, actually, who weren't neighbors or, whatever, sued the city of Chicago because they said they were creating a ghetto, a racial and economic ghetto, because they continued to put low-income units in the same location. Now, I know Alan said earlier, well, if you've got other land to give us, we'll build it there. But the main point not the main point, but one of the many main points, is that all across the country, this grad conversion is being implemented. Not everybody has the space, not every housing authority has the space to add units, much less this scale of units compared to what already exists in that neighborhood. Not just the high-rise and low-rise, but Hudson Terrace, Provincewell, Schuyler Court, everything else that's down there. We currently have about, between vouchers and apartments, we currently have about 600 units in the city that are already subsidized, not counting this new batch. We only have a population of maybe 7,000, maybe not. 6,300? Okay, if you just say on average there are 2.5 people living in each apartment, that's a pretty low average, but let's just say, because they're combining elderly and family. You're talking about upwards of 20-something% of our population already is on a subsidy, on a rental subsidy. And not only that, they are mostly confined to this one quadrant of the city. So I have a major problem with that. I feel that we are really continuing to put everything on in that one section. I think I thought it was interesting also that the city, I just found this out at the last meeting, that the city and the school district both opted out of being the lead agency on the pilot discussions. They're leaving that to the county, which, as we all know that live in the city, the county really doesn't care that much about what happens in the city.
What's that based on, Mary? What are you saying?
Based on the meeting last week. That's what we were told by the board sitting there in front of us. That the county economic...
No.
That's not that what was said? I asked about the school district specifically, and they said
The
they
school
wanted to...
district is involved with the pilot for it.
Okay, and what about the city?
I think you're misinterpreting what I said, which is that the school district does not participate in the city's IDA. They do not send a representative. The city will be handling any...
Will the city be handling the negotiations for the pilot?
Yes.
Okay, then I stand corrected. Then I stand corrected. Okay, so that's it for now. There's plenty more.
Mary, how would you boil that down to what would you like us as council members to do? I think if I heard you, you're saying don't build it there, or don't build it. It's not clear to me how you would boil it down.
I think there's just too many. It's a 70-something, but there's a potential of 140.
Yeah, I mean,
okay,
I think that's, and just if I may interrupt, that's also, your point also stands, the document that we adopted, the Strategic Housing Action Plan, doesn't envision a continuing of concentration of lower AMI housing in one particular neighborhood. We seek to move toward a true mixed income tapestry to housing in here.
Well, if I could,
I mean, if $800,000 was invested, and again, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, if $800,000 was invested to do a study of this addition, could that $800,000 have been put to better use in building maybe a lesser number of units that would serve the population, the higher end of the population, without having to meet the HUD requirements of whatever, 30%, 30%?
well, if I could address that a little bit. The only increment of Section 8 here is the small 36-unit senior building that's been proposed. So Bliss Towers is not going anywhere.
We don't want it to go anywhere.
Okay, so that's 120 units. So, and then the family units, we do feel are in a range, they're rent restricted, but they are in keeping with the housing study and what we've seen in the market, and the top tier of those units are very close to market rents.
Do you have that
So,
study?
We've talked about at the Housing Authority meeting recently, we will be submitting that to the planning board as part of the SECRA process.
Yeah, and we'll also be submitting it to the city council as well. And so I think that once the city council has the opportunity to take a look at the housing study, engage in a conversation, again, it's a bit of an iterative process here, engage in a conversation with the housing authority and with developers as to what the exact demand is, and everyone somewhat be on the same page. I think that we can come to some sort of resolution on that. What we propose right now is, one, what we think the need is based on our research. Two, what we also think can be financed or will be financed by the state. And in terms of if there's changes to that or whatever, it may change the financing some, it may change the scope of the project. But this isn't necessarily a project that's being proposed based on how much money it will make or how much financing we get, but it's based on what the housing authority has identified as the needs it wants to meet.
Yeah, that leads me to another question. If this was it could be separated out into two things. If you could talk about a renovation of Bliss, which we all would agree needs to happen on its own without the large-scale scope of this project. Is the large size of this project due to the financing of it, or could there be something done on a smaller scale that was just simply for a rad conversion of Bliss and renovation there? Is it truly based on local demand, or is it specific to it?
It's based on what the board of the authority has determined is the scope of the project.
Well, let's hear from someone else. Let's hear
Matthew Frederick, Union Street. 3 economic questions or comments, and then one maybe a little bit more about vision and planning. I too get nervous about the pilot payments because there's no more revenue for the city. Right, so a given household needs a certain amount of services, and here are 73 new units for which that will need 73 households worth of services from the city and will not be paying 73 households worth of taxes to the city. So we just set ourselves up constantly with these pilot payments to bankrupt ourselves. I want somebody to just show me how that works and is actually a benefit. A question about some of the basic math. $52 million. There's 200 roughly units. That's $260,000 per unit. I know not all of it's going into the units themselves, but I'm just trying to figure out how we get to $52 million. 60% of this project will be owned by PRC, is my understanding. And if it's $50 million or whatever, there is this potential for the HHA to buy it back in year 14-15. We need to know more about how that math works, because 60% of $50 million is $30 million. I know that HHA won't have that in their pockets at the time. So what is that formula? How does that work? Finally, I want to talk just the vision question of State Street needs buildings. That is just a no man's land down there. It feels dangerous. It's not. I've walked down there. It just feels bad to walk down State Street in this emptiness with no buildings on either side of you. We need buildings on State Street. We should look at this as an opportunity to develop State Street in a way that will generate revenue for the city, full property tax paying units. So if you're going to anchor one end of State Street with a new building, 1,000 feet away at the other end, Kite's Nest is looking at putting buildings in as well. As a city, we should be looking at how are those things going to connect, because there's a chance to create a cityscape there. We're not doing it. We're kind of all in our own silos, and we need to think about how it's all going to work together.
Just a clarification on the extent of the project itself. You've described this as the 2 buildings and the addition and the rehabilitation of Bliss. But there's also been much discussion about another 70-odd units on the existing footprint of the federal property there, which would entail taking down the low-rise and building some other set of units in there. And that's been before the planning board. It has been discussed at the HHA board meetings, and that I think is part of the apprehension that you're hearing here, is that in effect, you're talking now about 196 units total with the existing towers, but there is also the addition of 70.
Well, I have to defer to the housing authority really on that, because we're not necessarily involved in that
So
hypothetical.
two things. First, I want to address the buyback comment, the purchase back comment. So the purchase back is not based on
Cost of the building.
cost of the building, $30 million. The purchase back is essentially what ends up happening is at that 15-year period, whatever's left on developer fees to PRC would be paid. It's not going to be much based on the pro forma that we've got. Whatever is remaining in financing, the housing authority would assume, and then legal fees is essentially.
Yeah, what all the investors look for to exit is other exit taxes,
Right.
which are, right.
And so yeah, we're not talking millions of dollars there. We're talking, I mean, I don't know what the numbers are, but it's not millions of dollars. I don't believe it would probably even be $1 million if we're just assuming
Exit taxes, yeah.
Right. So that's one. So it's in regards to these 80 units on the west side of the Bliss Tower property. I'm assuming the planning board knows about State Environmental Quality Review Act, SEQR. My understanding is that that the planning board will likely be SEQR lead agency. As part of SEQR, if there is a remote possibility that land controlled by the applicant could be used for potential development, in any SEQR review you need to disclose, and it needs to disclose that it could be used for potential development in the future. And the SEQR review process requires you to consider the entire project as one. We as attorneys who do this, we advise a very conservative approach, which means we are looking at this expansively so that there could be a robust, full SEQR review. We said to the engineers, how many units do you think you could fit there if we want to put something there? They said, roughly 80. We said, okay, let's put it on the plan. So that way, what we were looking at when you were doing when the planning board does a SEQR review of the project, and you as a city council, as an involved agency, submit your comments on the SEQR review of the project, what you're doing is you are considering environmental impacts of the full site. Now, those 80 units are highly speculative. There is no plan. There is nothing that is in the works or anything like that. It is simply to make sure that there is a full SEQR review of the project. To the extent that the city would like to see something, the city council would like to see something different happen with that property, or that part of the property, that's a conversation that I think the authority welcomes and would want to have, and would want to find out, what the city is envisioning or would like to see different.
I was at that planning board meeting. I was curious that there weren't any plans or any mention of need to submission of any plans for the redevelopment of Bliss, for the rehabilitation. And so I'm just curious, because if it is, it's not going to be a like for like, I think, in that case. There would be some substantial rehabilitation. It says substantial rehabilitation, I imagine you have to see an engineering study.
So in regards to Bliss, because we're presenting this entire project to the planning board, we have not done an analysis as to, does the Bliss Tower rehab require site plan approval or not? What I'll say is this: there are certain elements of the Bliss rehab that likely would require site plan approval. There's some site work that's being done on that portion of the property to change the parking lot. That would require site plan approval. There is, again, I haven't looked at this, but there is an argument to be made that the exterior skin on the building would likely require planning board site plan approval. As far as the interior renovations, those would not require planning board approval. And so if all we were doing was going in and doing interior renovations, we'd just be pulling a building, pulling a building construction. So we are presenting the entire project as one to the planning board. We recognize that there's kind of two segments to it, 3 segments to it. And, we believe that by going through the seeker review process with the planning board, with the input from city council, as well as other involved agencies, including the authority planning board, the authority board, which is an involved agency, all of those environmental issues that you're clearly aware of I imagine are going to be addressed and discussed.
May I follow up? Because, Dan, thank you, but there's two questions, and I think that you've melded into seeker, which has to do with site plan, et cetera, and the property itself, and I understand why you've added the additional units, but it's the policy question of adding those additional units anytime, whether it's tomorrow or 10 or 12 years into, 15 years into the future, that I think is what, let me put it this myself, that's the concern I'm expressing is, are those, two pieces please, are those additional units necessary even to consider at all? And B, I have a secondary concern which has to do with the low-rise, because you're proceeding with a renovation of for the folks who live in the towers, but in effect you're putting the low-rise tenants off on the side and saying we'll deal with you later. And insofar, if indeed that is correct, if I'm correct about that, that also sort of makes it somewhat more likely that indeed the policy question of adding those additional units in order to replace the low-rise would be sort of on the city's docket sooner rather than later.
So can I respond?
Sure,
Okay,
please.
so in terms of the policy question, absolutely, that's a conversation that the authority needs to have with the city council as to the policy as what is, are any more units necessary or required or wanted for that portion of the property? There's going to be a market study, again, that we're all going to look at. We're all going to be looking at the same market study. We also have the DRI plan that was done, and we have the city's own housing task force. So we're all going to be working off the same documents, and I think that's going to be a discussion that the housing authority is more than happy to have and wants to have as to making sure that this project works. As far as those additional units, we just have to have that conversation. And to the extent that the city wants to foreclose something, future development on that, or make it open for different development, all those options and alternatives, I think the authority is more than willing to listen to, engage with, and have a discussion about. And having talked with the authority through this issue, I feel safe saying that they do want to have that discussion. This is not we're doing this in X amount of years, and that's it. So that's the discussion that we recognize needs to be had, and we look forward to having as we go through this public planning process. As far as the low-rise units, there's a fair amount of low-rise units already that are in significant disrepair that are not occupied. The vast majority of the families, I think, other than two, are what's called overhoused. They're in a unit that has too many bedrooms necessarily for the number of members of that family. And so part of the goal here in doing this project is to transfer those families who are overhoused into either renovated units on Bliss, or if there's seniors, into the new units on State, if their income levels are at a level where they can qualify for the mixed unit, family unit housing into there. So the goal is to transition people out of the low-rise units into the new units. And current residents are going to get preference on this project. The two families that are in that are appropriately housed, there is no plan to remove those units, and the housing authority will continue to address those needs and make sure that those units remain available to those families until they're vacated by the family.
If there is no specific, even general plan for housing on the west side, is there a way of suggesting seeker that would simply not say housing, but say other development? Because right now the assumption is that it's housing Because that's what we were told.
Because that's what the authority does.
Right. Well,
The authority is in the business of providing residences,
Thank
so that's
you.
what we do.
Thank you.
You know, as far as going through the seeker process, we want a seeker process that is fully engaged as to looking at the environmental impacts and really assessing them and really addressing or mitigating, mitigating real environmental impacts. So we're not trying to skirt the issue here. To the extent that the city wants to see something other than housing done there, again, very happy to have that discussion. To the extent that the city has site control of other properties in the city that they would prefer to see, a more dispersed housing, again, happy to have that discussion, happy to talk about alternatives. And so, why this land? Because this is the land the authority owns. We've recognized that there's a need. We're trying to meet that need.
one last question, if you may. The
Can we
procedure.
finish?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
It's okay. To the extent that there are other available parcels, happy to have that discussion. But what we are trying to do is, what the authority is trying to do is, the authority has assessed its own needs, in particular to the seniors living in Bliss, and has made a determination that the best thing for the seniors is to give them a dedicated building. That also then allows transfer of people in arguably substandard housing in the townhome, in the low-rise units, to move into Bliss, as well as people that are actually on the waiting list. The 40 units, that's straight out of the DRI plan, and those incomes levels are pretty close to what I've seen, or I should say that in my opinion they match, but we can talk about it as to what came out of the DRI process.
Brief process question. As I understand it, from the letter you originally submitted to the planning board, once the planning board has completed its review and decided its view of this, then there's a report made to the council. At that point, then the council and the city would have an opportunity to formally review the project as approved by the planning board. But if seeker is part of the planning process and they're the lead agent, would not seeker be completed by the time the report gets there?
No. Well, yes, seeker will be completed by the time the report gets there, but as an involved agency, the city council has the ability to address its environmental concerns regarding the project to the planning board, as does New York State Housing Community Renewal, who is a involved agency, New York State Housing Finance Agency, who's an involved agency, the county, and the authority board. Those are all involved agencies. And so through the seeker process, those things will be accounted for. To the extent that the city, I'm not court counsel for the city, so I can't tell you what the city would want to do, but to the extent that they want to do a meeting, that the city council wants to do a combined meeting with the planning board or something along those lines, look, we recognize that it's a big project. We recognize that there are great concerns. We recognize that it needs to go through a robust seeker review process, and we look forward to doing that. And to the extent that we're here tonight at a meeting that we're not required to do, but we want to be here because we want to inform everyone fully about the project and have a robust discussion about it. And so, to the extent that the planning board as lead agency and the city council as an involved agency and the authority board as an involved agency say, let's have a combined meeting to really flesh out some of these things and allow the city council to work through some things with everyone else, more than happy to do that.
We have another question over here. Yes.
No, mine is not.
Please stand up and your name and where you are.
My name is Rita Hansberry, and I'm a resident at Bliss Towers, and it's not so much a question. I've been here in Hudson for about 10 years now, and when I came here, it's almost like I'm hearing the same things, that Bliss Towers was really built for, seniors, but it was divided and everything. You had one side and you had the other side. there wasn't enough seniors here at that time, really. I've only been here 10 years. There wasn't enough seniors at that time, if I heard the story right. And then Providence Hall came about. Now you have to remember, this is from talking to people in the neighborhoods and stuff like that. But it almost sounds like as if, it's almost like it's repeating itself. But my main thing is, I come from the city, and I know what it is to be stacked on top of people. It is not a good way to live. It's not the worst way to live, but it's, you know, it's not the best way. And I just think if you're going to do housing or whatever, because Hudson has such architectural, you know, and everything, that this one little area will almost look like a little New York City or any type of urban development, just when you come downtown into that area. And I think it'll take away a little bit from the beauty of Hudson, all the environment, the rich environment that we have around us. I'm all for low income, affordable, because we have a need for that. We really do, but the design, I think, if anything, we have 2 large buildings here already. We have Providence Hall, and we have Bliss Towers. For me, I think that's enough. And I think when people own or are able to rent to own, they take more pride in where they live than when you just take people and put them in warehouses and stack them on top of each other. That's all I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the back, in the back.
Hi, Storka Fairbank, First Ward. I have hopefully a really simple question to be clarified. These 76 apartments on State Street, excuse me, I keep hearing about this market study and the need. These are existing individuals and families in Hudson who need places. Is that what I understand from the last few meetings?
Yes, that's right. So the senior component is targeted to families, seniors already living at Bliss Towers.
So that's, I mean, it's right, it's existing. In Hudson
existing.
already.
And then the family, we see a need in the city of Hudson for this kind of workforce level to moderate income housing that, because as we noted that in this handout, I think over 40% of Hudson renters pay more than 35% of their income for rent.
Okay, so then I have a part 2 to my question. Your third paragraph on your economic impact says that these 76 new apartments will bring $3 million in economic spending annually. If they're already existing families, where does that come from?
Well, it would be it's a good part. The 40 are the new family units. The 36 are seniors moving from, ideally from Bliss to the new
but they're already
senior
living
building.
here, that economic impact.
Right, and then and that would free up units inside Bliss. As the Housing Authorities mentioned, they have a 2.5-year waiting list. So that would be people who are on the waiting list now and are not living at Bliss Towers, so they would move into Bliss Towers, and that would be.
So this is bringing new people from outside.
The Housing Authority would have to give you more. I mean, the economic impact study was a very analysis was making that general assumption. The Housing Authority will have to give you more information on the wait list, specifically about the current residents.
Okay, so we have a few more. We're going to try to wrap this up in a little bit. So, Alan?
Rich, I'd just like to give everybody here an idea of something that we're dealing with right now. A building sells in Hudson, an apartment building. In that building, we have 3 Section 8 tenants. Their rent currently is $850 a month. HUD's budget, they're 1-bedroom apartments. HUD's budget for 1-bedroom apartments is $749. The new landlord has decided to raise the rents to $1,350. We have no place else to put them. So we have to pay that rent, which takes money away from other Section 8 tenants. So, you know, we have no choice. One of the tenants is 95 years old. He's been there for 20 years. So, you know, this is not a one-off occurrence in Hudson, as we all know. The other thing about this project is that these Section 8 vouchers, I believe, Brian, you can correct me, eventually will go with the individual. So if that person wants to leave Hudson and move to Florida, they can take their Section 8 voucher with them.
The Housing Authority's Housing Choice, that's true about the Housing Authority's Housing Choice Voucher Program. These would be at the Housing Authority's option, project basing those, so they are attached to the unit to make the units permanently affordable.
Yeah.
For the term of for the 20-year term of the contract on the senior units. Then it'd be the Housing Authority's choice on what to do after the initial 20-year contract period.
Yeah, and there's also a Section 8 program where someone that gets Section 8 can actually use their Section 8 check to purchase a house, and it will to pay their mortgage with their Section 8 check. So, you know, this does offer a lot more flexibility than what is currently offered in Bliss Towers. You know, there is mobility along with the Section 8 program. So it's, you know, I know it's got a bad name, but there's actually a lot of benefits to Section 8. So.
Two more.
I had asked 3 questions earlier. I think only one was addressed. One was how do we get to 52 million, because with 73 new units plus a rehab of existing ones, I'm having trouble getting actually anywhere near the 52 million. And I didn't know if the committee intended to comment or not on the pilot in lieu of, rather than full tax revenues. But if it is a $52 million project, a very schematic way to look at this is to say $52 million worth of housing. What would you get? What would the city receive in tax revenues, taxed at full value? What will we likely get for a pilot for this project? There's your shortfall.
So the budget question is just, that includes not just the construction, but when doing any affordable housing, particularly with the state bond financing, there are a lot of costs we're paying to the state in financing fees and interest costs, architecture, so all of the other what they call soft costs are in there. So that's how it's not just the construction costs, which are the biggest component of it, but you know, which I think is over 30 million, over 40 million even, but it's not.
What's your square foot cost estimate?
I'll have to get off the top of my head. Get back to you on that. Get back to you on that.
If you want, I'll answer this pilot question.
Okay.
In terms of pilot, again, under the real property tax on the public housing law, property of the authority is exempt from real property taxes, statutorily based. When we're talking about value of the property for an income-producing property like this, again, the value is going to be based upon the income. It's not going to be based upon the cost to construct. We have no idea what the assessed value would be. But again, in terms of a pilot payment, whether we want to structure it as a per unit basis, or structure it based on income, and that's all things that we can discuss, all things that we look forward to working through with the City Council.
Okay. 3 more, Linda and Brett, and then Eric.
Just have we pay sewer bills here, we pay water here. There's that's a lot of infrastructure that we have to serve this large, complicated. I mean, the numbers keep changing, but it's a big project and it adds more onto our infrastructure, which is already overtaxed. We have a lot of sewer and stormwater issues right now, which we're way behind on addressing, and this overtaxes an already overtaxed system. We have huge parking issues in our community, and that is, I don't hear much about that. I've also want to remind people there is a comprehensive plan for the city of Hudson. As outdated as it is, I don't believe in that plan that we talked about desiring high-density housing in the city. We also have an LWRP. It is discussing the waterfront. This is in the waterfront. It is in the waterfront district. The issue is, what do we want our waterfront to look like? And if you look from the other side of the river at Hudson, you see a high-density population, populated visually buildings of large, that looks like New York City is. Is that what we want our city to look like? And there's a lot of questions which are also related to economic development issues that we really need to think about. I understand it is a housing authority's property and they do have a lot of leeway, and it's a very important, Bliss Towers plays, and the Bliss landscape plays a very important role in our community. And we don't want to understate that. It's a very important element. But I mean, it is my neighborhood. I live on the 300 block of State Street. It is an area to load all this new development on, I think creates an energy that affects the entire community. And it's an economic effect as well as how are we going to live in this city together, and what do we want it to be, and how to build it together. And this really isolates a particular part of the city. And I also, one more question, there was a discussion from the mayor. The mayor did say one thing, he said this had nothing to do with the housing strategic plan. Unless I misunderstood the mayor, he said it did not represent what the strategic plan was developed to do. The other issue, he had suggested at one time the daycare center potentially was going to be put in this building. Is that off the table?
As far as I know, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Rich, wait a minute, I'd just like to address one thing Linda said, and the Housing Authority does pay water and sewer bill to the city. Okay.
And we have
Brett,
And yes, and we do have ample room for off-street
So
parking.
5 more minutes, folks. So, Brett, yes, Laura?
Oh, okay, the, two things, the development description says of Bliss Towers, the 120 units will be rehabilitated. What about the 15 units in the Lowrise? And will they also be redeveloped?
Right now, that's not, as we talked about, is not part of this project. The Housing Authority will deal with that separately, but it's not part of the project we're working on.
Okay.
As part of the
All right, and then the other thing, and this doesn't affect the project, but you call it Columbia Apartments, and I thought that there was something, the development was going to be called State Street Apartments.
The name hasn't been settled on yet. We haven't gotten to that stage yet.
Because
so
right now,
placeholder.
Columbia Apartments is the name given to the low-rises on this property.
Well, it's the whole project.
So,
Yeah, it's the whole campus is known as Columbia Apartments.
so the whole campus is going to be known as Columbia
Well,
Apartments?
no, it currently is. Yeah, that's the legal name. If you look on tax rolls, it's under.
We have in the back, Lou?
Yeah, Peter Steer, Fourth Ward. Yeah, my question's about the strategic housing plan. I maybe 2 questions. One is, how would you describe the role that it played in the development to this point? Like and then I know it hits 2 of the 4 goals that the plan has. So I'm sure you've dealt with this at a level of detail that I don't necessarily follow, but I'm curious, what role did it play in the development of the plan so far, and where it diverges from the strategic plan? Why does it?
Well, I think the role it plays starts well before our firms were selected. The Housing Authority has gone through a long planning process that led to the RFP for the development, for developer partners, and they can speak more to that, but that strategic housing plan was part of their process for planning. And then after we were selected, we did a lot of work with the Housing Authority as well as some of the community meetings, but we talked extensively about the Housing Authority about what could go on State Street, and that plan was one of the resources used. I don't think, honestly, that it does diverge from the plan. The Housing Action Plan, as I read, called for it did say it liked higher income units, but it also said there was an overall housing need and a mix of incomes needed. So no one project could fulfill every aspect of that plan, and combined with the Housing Authority's policy goals, we thought this was the best project for that site.
Yeah, I agree. The action plan and the DRI plan were part and parcel of the board's consideration, or documents that they relied upon and used when they were putting together the RFQ. In the authority's view, it's consistent throughout.
There's a divergence of opinion on whether it actually adheres. Is what I hear.
And I think, in some extent, people can reasonably disagree as to, well, this is not, or maybe this isn't. I think what we've done is, the authority's done with PRC is we put together a project that we believe is consistent and also meets the goals of the authority, the goals that the authority has in particular with its senior units. And we're offering that to the planning board. It's under the public housing law. The city council is going to have to approve this project as well. And so it's, to the extent that as we move through, tweaks or changes or whatnot happens along the way, that's a discussion we're willing to have.
And last question, we have just a few more minutes.
So this is really, I'd asked this question a couple times, and as Alan pointed out so kindly, I come late to the party. But that having been said, is there more than one way to skin a cat? That's what it really comes down to. We've got, is there a way to do the rehab of, now I just learned something new, which was that the low-rise is not even going to be being fixed up. So is there a way to fix the high-rise, fix the low-rise, scale back this project, and the money that's going to be made, the economic benefit, let's all call a spade here, if you don't mind an old farming phrase, which, don't take offense.
No.
It's not, okay. It's not meant that way.
I know.
There is money to be made here. The economic benefit is going to be to the developer. I know that, you know that. Tax credits are worth big, big bucks. The bigger you can make the project, the more tax credits you have to sell. And that's the bottom line. So that's my,
That's what I was also curious initially too about it. If you broke out into two, is there an A and B if there's a rehabilitation of Bliss, but it can't be done through a public partnership because the scale's too small? Or does it have to?
They do that all the time.
Yeah,
I mean, 30-something units of elderly housing here, 28 units.
I was wondering if it was considered just to squarely do Bliss.
We did look at a couple iterations of it, and we found with the Housing Authority and with the state funding programs that the most efficient would be to be able to do Bliss and State Street at the same time. There are ways to, as Dan said, change the project. That at a certain point, the scale would be too small to be.
These are competitive funding. This is competitive funding, and so at some point it becomes too small if it loses its competitive nature to it. And as far as why did we do it this way? The board did their due diligence as board members. They looked at a lot of different options, a lot of different processes, and the board, in their independent discretion that they have as a governmental agency, made the determination that this path forward was in the best interest of its residents, and that's the determination they made.
All right, I'd like to wrap this up. Thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate everyone for coming. Third Thursday of the month, economic development. I'm happy to continue this conversation at a later time. If you want to have another conversation again next month or something, I'll leave it up to this committee to determine. But thank you all very much for coming, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.